right, everyone. How are you doing? I am Arwan Cameron. This is The Conduit. This is our afternoon show, Conversations and Housing Concerns with BHA and KCR. But as you know, on the second Tuesday, we go into our deep dive conversation. And this month, we're talking about monitoring. So, we have the great Kirsten Jewell with us today. So we're always excited when she joins us. How are you doing, Kirsten?
I'm doing great. I love being here, and that applause always makes me smile.
Good. You know what? And we need smiles, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And today we are joined by Virginia McCauskin, McCausklin,
McCaslin.
McCaslin. She's the grants coordinator, and so we're going to give her the same horn and applause. Now Virginia has lost her voice, so she is with us in spirit. May tune in or type something in the chat to add to perspective. But we're so glad that she is joining us today. So welcome, Virginia, to the Conduit. And then, of course, we have Katie Sharp. All right. BHA's own superhero and also Kitsap Housing and Homeless Coalition superhero. She wears a lot of hats and she makes sure that everyone is connected. So welcome, Katie. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you, Marwan.
So we were going to have Jill today as was kind of alluded to last week, but she is in a meeting, but she's back and she's doing well. So we will welcome her back next week. And Matt is having some health issues, so we will see Matt in the future too, but he's probably watching us right now. But let's go ahead and jump in because this is a really big topic on monitoring. So, Katie, is it okay if we start with Joel in Virginia?
Oh, yeah, no problem.
All right. Katie says it's okay. So let's go.
Okay. Well, I think this topic came up during our last deep dive conversation a month ago, and I can't remember what the context is that we were talking about. I think maybe we were describing some of the work that we're doing right now in our division, and the topic of monitoring came up. And then we sort of all decided, hey, that would be a really good thing to talk about more extensively. Really sorry that Jill and Matt aren't able to be here. They have a different perspective on monitoring than we do here at the county. But I just wanted to cover a couple of topics and then answer any questions that might be out there, or have um, additional people sort of amplify what we're talking about. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is sort of, why do we do monitor? What do we mean by monitoring, and why do we do monitoring? So all of the grant funds that our division administers, and that many of the nonprofits in our community are using to operate, have a lot of rules and restrictions attached to them. So when the federal government or the state government or the local county government or the city government decides that they're going to set aside some money for grants, especially around housing grants is what I'm most familiar with, they add a bunch of rules and regulations around what that funding can be used for. And sometimes those restrictions are around who can use the money, what kind of organization. Always there's some kind of restriction around what kind of households can benefit from the funding. There's rules around what the money can be spent on to help households. And there's restrictions on kind of how the organizations are run, or how the programs are run that are administering the funding. So there's a lot of rules around these different grant funding sources. And unfortunately, each of the rules for each of the different grant programs is a little bit different and has different requirements. Typically, the most complicated grants to administer are federal grants. They have the most rules around them and the most complex regulations. And then next are the state grants. And then next are the local grants. A lot of the grant funding that our division administers that goes to our partner organizations doing work in the homeless sector are actual pass-through money. So even though it's getting granted to an organization by the county, it's actually federal or state money. And when that federal and state money comes, even though it comes through Kitsap County, all of the rules that were made by the people who made that funding available still apply. So even if your organization is getting federal money, even if your organization is getting money granted to you by Kitsap County, if it's federal funding, you still have to follow all the federal rules. And that can be pretty complicated. So there are, with every grant funding source, there's sort of a book of guidelines that says, here's what the rules are for spending this money. At the federal level, it's kind of convoluted, and they have what's called CFRs, which are different, basically the laws that govern the use of funding. At the state level, they tend to issue these in grant guideline books. And at the county level, we also have grant guideline books. So if you're receiving a grant through Kitsap County, typically you have to comply with all the guidelines in the federal rules, all the guidelines in the state rules, and all the local guidelines that we give you in our guidebook. So, and they aren't different rules. It's just sometimes there's additional overlays of more things. So there'll be federal rules, and then the state will say, oh, and we also want you to do these things, or here's exactly how we want you to do that federal rule, what that looks like. And then the same thing at the local level. We might say, in addition to the federal and state rules, there's also these other rules that you need to follow, or here's how we want you to actually use that funding. So what monitoring means is that there is a exploration of, or a review of, the way that the program is being operated at the sort of nonprofit level, let's say, or at the county level, or at the state level. So the federal government will monitor to make sure that the state is spending the money the way they want that money to be spent. The state will monitor local, county, and city governments to make sure the money is being spent the way they want it to be spent. And county governments will monitor our nonprofit grantees to make sure that the money is being spent the right way. So there's a lot of different layers of monitoring that happen. And what the monitoring looks like is typically looking at all of the way that the program is operated. So making sure that all of the policies are in place that are required for a particular grant program, making sure that only eligible people are receiving the money, making sure that only eligible expenses are being used to spend the money, and just making sure that the program meets all of these federal, state, and local requirements to comply with that, with those requirements. I want to make a small distinction between monitoring and auditing. So most larger organizations get audited, and that is more about their financial policies and guidelines and procedures and how they're spending their money and complying with sort of generally accepted accounting principles. Typically, an organization will pay a private company to come in and audit them. And that private company will crawl through all of their accounting stuff, all their bookkeeping, financial software, all of their expenses and income and contracts and all that, and make sure that they're doing it correctly. And then they produce at the end of that an audit report. And in that, they detail if there's any problems with the way that the organization financials are run. And typically those audits are for the whole organization. Monitoring is a little bit different. We also look at all of the financial information, but we're more focused on a particular program. How does that program have policies and procedures to make sure that the money is being spent the way it's supposed to be spent on the eligible expenses for that program? And then we also monitor on eligibility, which audits don't typically do. Eligibility is around like making sure that the funding is only going to benefit people who fit into the category that the grant funding is able to serve. So, for example, a lot of times the grant funding source will say you can only serve people who are actively experiencing homelessness and have an area median income of 30% or less. So when we do the monitoring, we have to go in and make sure that all the people that receive the benefit of this funding meet that criteria. And nobody is over 30% area median income, or nobody who's already housed is getting served, or whatever that criteria is. And so we have to do a lot of checking over documentation and paperwork and applications and eligibility documentation to make sure that all of that eligibility is being followed by the grant program.
And that reminds me, Kirsten, of like even the definition of homelessness. Like it is different based on the funding. I know like sometimes it's okay if they're couch surfing, and I know a lot of KCR funding, it's not okay if they're couch surfing.
Right. So that's one of the eligibility pieces, is knowing how the eligibility is defined for that particular grant program. Yeah, I just wanted to pause there, Marwan. Like that's kind of a high level. I mean, there's a lot more complexity around monitoring, but I wanted to, well, let me make a couple of more quick points.
Sure.
Typically monitoring happens once a year. And we at the county level typically monitor our subgrantees or subcontractors once a year for each grant program. So if you have 3 grant contracts with us, we'll be monitoring you on all 3 grant contracts. During the pandemic, we suspended some of the monitoring requirements because there was so much concern about people going on site or being in the same room together. So we did much more lighter monitoring. We might maybe requested documents from you via email, but we didn't do the extensive on-site monitoring. But now we are back to doing on-site monitoring, and Virginia McCaslin, who's here with us, is a county employee. She works in the Housing and Homelessness Division, and she has been doing a lot of the monitoring for our grant contracts recently. The state monitors counties every year also. And so when the state comes to monitor us, they do exactly the same kinds of things that we do with our subgrantees and subcontractors. They look at all of our documentation. They look at all of the reimbursement request paperwork that got turned in from our subcontractors. They look at all of our policies and procedures. They look at our accounting processes. They look at how we allocated the money. They look at our procurement process, all of that stuff. And they write up these reports about like whether we were doing all of that stuff right or not. And if we didn't do something right, it's a big deal. There's a big sort of public, hey, you didn't do this right, and you need to figure out how to do it better next time, and you need to fix it. And it's a really big deal if the county essentially gets a sort of a finding on our monitoring from the state or the when the county comes and audits our subcontractors, we're trying to make sure that you're doing everything correctly so that when the state comes and monitors us, we can show that we've been good administrators of the funding and that all of our subcontractors are following all of the rules that they're supposed to be following. I know there's a lot of frustration sometimes with all the county processes around reimbursement requests, and you have to turn in like all this different kinds of documentation to prove that your expenses are eligible and that you spent the money in the right time frame and all of that. And the reason we have to do that is because the state auditor is going to come and look at all of our paperwork and make sure that we made our subcontractors do that. And if they did, and if we didn't, then we get in big trouble. And so it's not that we are distrustful of our subcontractors, or it's not that we don't think you're doing a great job. It's that we know that the state is going to come and make us prove that we are doing a good job administering funds and collecting all the correct paperwork.
So let me ask you, Kirsten, because I know sometimes organizations can feel like, they are being targeted, um, and sometimes things change, right? You have a grant and you're executing the grant, and it's like okay, we need this new documentation. Um, is there a distinction on when it's coming through the Fed versus it's being executed from the county.
You mean a new requirement?
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes. So one thing that we found with the KEPA grant, so these are the grants that paid for the eviction prevention through the Kitsap Eviction Prevention Assistance Program. One thing that was really extra challenging about about that grant program is that the federal government rolled out some grant funding for this eviction prevention program, and they did not have all of the policies and procedures and guidelines figured out for that funding before they sent it out to the state and the county government. So at the county level, we got some of that funding we got directly from the Department of Treasury at the federal level. And some of that funding we got through a subcontract from the Department of Commerce at the state level. So we had both state funds and federal funds that were part of KEPA. And the federal government did not have all of the rules and guidelines figured out when they started rolling out that money. And they kept changing those over time. So we would be going along thinking, okay, we've got this program figured out. We're monitoring or administrating it the way we're supposed to. And then the federal government would say, oh, and by the way, you also need to be doing these 10 other things regarding data collection or administering this funding or whatever. So one thing that would happen is that sometimes we would get that direction from the federal government, and then sometimes we would get that direction from the state government, because the state government would take those guidelines that the federal government had now changed and interpret that through what's going to work best through the way that the state is running these grant programs. So most of the time, the changes were coming from the federal government changing their rules or refining their guidelines, or the state refining their guidelines. Every once in a while, a change will come because the county got audited by the state. And based on that audit, we were told that we were not doing something correctly, and we needed to have our subcontractors go back and fix it because we weren't requiring something that we needed to be, or our policy wasn't robust enough. So an example of this is in our KEPA guidelines, when we started out, we didn't have, I think we had just a very basic fraud prevention provision in our policy. It was pretty small, I think. And then the state government came back and said, you know what, that fraud prevention policy needs to be more beefed up, and it needs to have some more specific language in it. So we're going to make all of our counties that we contract with have fraud prevention language in their policies. So we updated our KEPA guidelines and we reflected that policy. Then the state got audited, and the federal auditor said, we think your fraud prevention policy needs to include even more stuff. And so the state said, okay, well, if you're going to make us include more stuff, then we're going to have to make our counties include more stuff. So then they wrote to us and said, you guys need to change your fraud prevention policy again. So we had to change our KEPA policy another time to reflect those changes. So I know it feels really for our subcontractors, it can feel really frustrating that we're constantly changing the guidelines and things are, not always staying the same, but it's always in response to some, federal or state guideline that is saying you got to do things differently in order to be meeting the rules of this program.
So what I appreciate you about bringing up this topic of monitoring in the early days of KEPA. I know that there's everyone's trying to figure it out, right? You're building the plane while you're flying it. And some of the challenges were from the experience of those that were executing the grants was, oh, there's this new change, right? And you feel like you're being picked on. And I don't think that it was articulated super clear that it's like, hey, this isn't the county, this is the feds that's requiring this. And so, it's just kind of how it goes, right? It's kind of like the telephone game. It's like, hey, this is what is now needed. And then this comes in and it's like, man, well, we just did this. Well, now we need to do this. And it's like, man, this county is, and it's like, it's actually not us. It really isn't us.
We're trying to it's super frustrating. And it's frustrating for us too. I think the other part to know about the KEPA program is that even though KEPA had one sort of front-facing umbrella program, it was actually funded by 5 different grants
Mm.
over the time that we've had it. And so sometimes what happens is that the different, so at first we were funding it with what was called the ERAP program. And ERAP was super light, had very little requirements on it. It was super, like, they were really just trying to, roll that funding out as fast as possible. It was like the easiest to administer grant funding that we had. And then that money ran out, and we started funding it with what we call TRAP program. And the TRAP is was some federal funding, actually. Some of it we got directly from the federal government, some of it we got from the state. That had more rules on it. That said, okay, now we have more requirements for eligibility. We have more requirements for, what policies and procedures your organization has to have in place. We have more requirements on, you know, eligible expenses. All of that sort of got tighter. Then we went to, another grant program, which was funding it. And so as we've gone through these different grant programs, that's also been why sometimes the grant requirements change, because we're actually working off of different grant guidelines behind the scenes. But we wanted, from the public perception, we want it to be very simple. The public doesn't care who's paying for the rental assistance, right? They just want to, they just need help. And so that's why we didn't want to confuse people with saying, like, okay, here's the ERAP program, the TRAP program, and the ERA program, and the, all of these different programs. And so behind the scenes, I always think of it as like the duck analogy, where there's a duck floating calmly on the top of the water, and all you see is the calm duck floating along. But under the water, their legs are like pedaling furiously to try to keep going. Like, that's how the pandemic has really been for us, especially around administering the Keeper program, because it has been constantly changing guidelines, constantly changing funding sources, constantly doing contract amendments to reflect these changes. And it's just been very challenging to keep it all, running smoothly from the public perception. And I know that is not always super clear to the public about why we're changing things. I wanted to say one more thing. We do not have different requirements for different contractors. When we roll out a requirement for it's one contractor. It is for all the contractors are required to meet that requirement. We never say, just you, Marwan, just you have to follow that rule, and Katie doesn't need to follow that rule. We have to enforce the rules or the guidelines and eligibility and expenses and how we track everything uniformly across all of our subcontractors. If we didn't, we would also get in big trouble for picking on somebody or having a different standard for a different agency. So even though it feels like maybe we're like bugging you in particular for whatever document we need, it's because we've already gotten that documentation from our other subcontractors, or maybe they submitted it in advance, or maybe their policies and procedures already included whatever element that we needed to include. And we just need to have you get up to kind of the same level. But yeah, we don't pick and choose about which agencies comply in different ways. We have to be doing it fairly and consistently across all of our sub-grants for the same
And
grant funding source.
I think that's some of the challenges with smaller orgs and new orgs doing business with the county, is, large organizations like, let's say, Bremerton Housing Authority. If there's a new mandate that comes down to execute a contract or a grant, they have staff to, provide what's needed pretty quickly. But smaller organizations are like, we're wearing multiple hats, and it's like, okay, so we need to do what now? How do we do this? How do we need to do it so it's in compliance? And you needed it yesterday. So then it does feel like it's, like you're being targeted, especially when, and I've seen it, where it's like the county, not the county, but the feds have said, okay, change, 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 change. It's like the changes are nonstop. What's going on? But they're catching up with how things are going. So it's pushing down, and so it's just rolling down. And so you feel like you're doing all this paperwork to execute the grant successfully, but you've been doing this work the whole time, and it's like, now you need this and now you need that. So the
And
question,
I will say that grant programs, I would say that KEPA is a little exceptional in the rate at which change was happening. Like, typically, I mean, most of the time the grant guidelines are known when we make a grant, and they might change once a year, right? Like they're not this constant change that we were doing during the pandemic days. Um, so that's pretty unusual that things would change so much. And I do agree that it is harder for smaller organizations that don't have experience with government contracting to kind of keep up with and catch up to kind of what the expectations are on these grants. And we've had conversations. Well, first of all, what I want to say is that we have not gotten any grace from the state auditor on doing things during a pandemic and doing things under extraordinary circumstances. We had kind of
Wow.
hoped that they would give us a little break because we were doing
Hmm.
this really important work and working really hard and had way more money than we'd ever had before. And we're just trying to get people helped. We've gotten zero like breaks or grace in how we did it. They are holding us to every I dotted, T cross, that we have to do it exactly the way that the most current guidelines say that we have to be doing it. Um, and so, we've had some conversations with the Department of Commerce at the state level, um, about, if you want to really make these kinds of grant programs work better for smaller community-based organizations, it's not enough that the Department of Commerce says, oh, you can lay off on these requirements, or the county government says these requirements can be easier. You have to get the state auditor to also be willing to cut us a break and not hold us to those same standards, because otherwise we have no ability to make any changes in what those requirements are. We have to follow what those requirements are, even if we think that they are difficult and onerous and create a lot of work for people. We don't really have a choice about whether we enforce those or not, because the state auditor isn't giving us a choice about whether they'll monitor on those or not.
Well, let me
So
add,
we've told the
as
state, you really need to have conversations with the auditor if you want us to be able to have easier, programs to administer, because that's where it really all has to start. Or with the
well, let
federal
me add
government, but I don't know if we have much traction with the federal government, but if we want it to be easier, we have to start at the top.
absolutely. Being an executive director of a small org, I can attest to the fact that, let's say, the whole KEPA program, there were a lot of changes, but we also have a contract with the county for transportation and food and other things, and that thing is like super smooth, super easy, no issues, no
Yeah.
problems, and that's the county, right? So we're not
That's
having
county
to
money.
change
That's county
everything.
money, and we can make it a lot easier because we don't have a
It's
higher
awesome.
authority that we have to
It's
report
great.
to. Yeah.
Yeah, hit
Yep.
hit the horn for that. So,
Yeah.
and we wanna be fair and be as, transparent as possible in that. So, it's like, it's not all bad, it's not all good, but in regards to how typically things run, they actually run pretty smooth. So, I just wanted to put that out
And
there. But
and one thing I will
what
say, Marwan, is that,
Mhm.
we at, my division has a huge commitment to providing technical assistance to organizations. Like, we are always available. We have spent countless hours helping our community-based organizations and our buy and for partners understand what the requirements are, know how to do it. We've given lots of support and help, as to the extent that we have the capacity to do that, because we know that this is a new scope of work for a lot of folks, and they've never done it before, and they've never contracted with the government, and like, we're trying to help be a good partner and make it be so that you all can be successful at this. But at the end of the day, we still have to have you comply with all these rules. We don't have any flexibility on saying you can comply or not. What we can help with is helping you understand what the rules are, helping you understand what you need to do to be in compliance with those rules, and then providing examples. For sometimes we will here's an example policy. If you don't know how to write one, here's an example of what it might look like, or something like that. So we can help, but that's also in addition to our other work. So it's we do have some capacity around that. I want to make sure Katie has enough time to chime in here too, because the housing authority gets monitored and audited all the time too, because they're mostly federal, right, Katie?
Yeah, so there's so many different like ways I can approach this, because yes, we get monitored. We also do monitoring.
Yes.
We also get audited. We get many types of audits. So I guess I'll start with something that's been on everybody's mind recently, because the city of Bremerton budget has come up as a really interesting topic. So we have a grant from the city of Bremerton to administer $100,000 of rental assistance right now. And that program alone can be used for different things. Then we decided to do a city of Bremerton match, where we expanded the use of it. So we match it the 100,000 and we expand the use of it. And then we have the KEPA program. So those are 3 of the rental assistance programs we've had in the last few years. And just those alone each have their own different requirements. They each have their own forms, and they can only be used for certain things. But to Kirsten's point, like the public doesn't need to know that. They don't need to know which program they are qualified for or whatnot. It's really our job, and I've heard Matt say it a lot too. It's really our job to say, what's your situation? Okay, I have this funding. But it's hard, right? Because then where are you on the list? If you don't say it right, then do you get the help? I remember Matt saying that, like, if you come and you say to the front desk a certain program, they just can say no or yes. But if you say I'm homeless, and they say, okay, this is the path for you. So it's really important to understand that that's why there's a lot of forms, is because each program has different requirements. And sometimes they don't communicate with each other. Even if you're in the same organization and you want to get the funding out right away, like our city of Bremerton and our city of Bremerton match, verifying income could be in a different process because of the documents that are needed for those programs. And we try to streamline it, but it's always a process. So do you wait until it's all streamlined and all ready to go, then do distribute the funding? Or do you just put it out there just so everybody can use it, and then you kind of figure it out along the way? And a lot of times we choose the second option. So right now we're kind of working around that, because our voucher holders have a whole process of verifying their income before getting a voucher. But if they want the city of Bremerton, if they qualify for city of Bremerton deposit assistance or something like that, they also have to verify their income, just so we have the proper documents to distribute those funds to them through that program. So it's so interesting to think about it in that perspective of, like, there's a lot of forms and sometimes they don't communicate with each other.
Can I say one quick thing, Katie, on that?
That's a great point.
I think that we were pretty darn innovative here in Kitsap with the KEPA program, because a lot of counties went down the road where they had, maybe they had 3 of these different grant programs operating in their county at the same time, and they had 3 different applications that people would have to submit to be eligible for those 3 different grant programs. And what we said here in Kitsap is, that's ridiculous. We're going to make one application, which we called the KEPA pre-application, and people would just fill the pre-application out, and then it would get looked at by people who know all of these different grant programs and say, this is the one that you best qualify for. And then that staff would actually fill out that application for that specific grant program that's required to be used, and then give it to the client to sign. So we were trying to make it a lot easier by having a single application for rental assistance, rather than having people have to fill out 3 different applications and not knowing which one they're eligible for. So I think we did that right in Kitsap County. And there were some other counties that reached out to us and looked at our application or pre-application, and then ended up copying what we were doing, because it made it a lot easier for people who were needing the assistance.
And I think that was really noticed too, because you just had to go and fill out a quick form, and you didn't have to know any more details other than, I'm facing eviction or I need rental assistance. You just had to know that, and then it's like, okay, I'll fill out an application. And the administrative work behind that is immense, and everybody, I think, could acknowledge that. And thank you to KCR especially for taking that on. And I know Matt comes on here every week talking about the wait list and getting the wait list down. And I can't imagine from your office what that took either, just that coordination. And so it was a lot of money that came through the KEPA program.
And
Yeah, I
everything
mean,
else is continuing on, right? It wasn't like you got to put everything else to the side. It's like, "Oh, hey, now you need to execute this and do that
Mhm.
at the same time."
yeah, just to give you kind of a perspective on it, our before the pandemic, my divisional budget was, I don't know, like 3.5 or $4 million a year that we would get in grant funding, and then we contracted out to shelters and transitional housing programs and all of that stuff. And then the pandemic came along, and our budget was more like $20 million a year, for a couple of years there. So all of a sudden, our work like quadrupled, right? We had 4 times as much work to do, and um, and no more staff to do it, and no time to do it, and just get that money out there. We have people who are desperately in need, and so we did our best, and it took us some time to hire a little more staff to help us out. And KCR had the same issue. They had staff that had the capacity to do the grant programs that they had, and the pandemic came along, and all of a sudden they got granted a whole bunch more of this KEPA money to distribute, and they had to spend some time to hire more staff to get that money out. And I think all of the organizations that we worked with had those similar sort of capacity issues. They weren't used to processing that level of funding. Well, now our challenge is that all that funding is going away, right? So we're going to have to contract again and say, okay, we don't have as much money. Our budget is back to more like it was before the pandemic. How do we kind of deal with that change, that expansion, and that contraction that we're seeing, and will probably be happening in 2023 is when we're expecting that funding to kind of shrink back to more like pre-pandemic levels.
So, let me ask you, Kirsten, um, now that we're kind of closing in on the end, what are some of the lessons learned going forward that you can implement either in future grants and contracts, or should we, knock on wood, have another pandemic and go through this again? What are some lessons learned, and how can we streamline some of these processes and keep lines of communication open, and things like that? Does the county kind of have some ideas on going forward?
A couple of thoughts come to mind. The state is in the process of essentially doing an evaluation of how their pandemic funding for homeless and eviction prevention programs worked during the pandemic. So they have a little working group, and I was participated in an input session. The state was asking how did our pandemic funding for homelessness and housing programs work for counties, and how can we do better next time? So essentially asking your question, what are the lessons learned here? So the state is really looking closely at what they could do better next time in the event of this kind of a situation. I don't think we've gotten to the point yet formally with Kitsap County where we're doing that evaluation. We still have pandemic money that is being spent out through the end of this year and probably a little bit into next year. When we get done with that, I think we'll have some bandwidth and some time to take a breath and have that conversation. One thing that we already are way ahead of in where we were when the pandemic started is that we have developed amazing relationships with organizations that we weren't working with before the pandemic. So we're already a big leap ahead of where we were at the beginning of the pandemic, when we didn't really have very many community-based organizations, any buy-in-fours that we were contracting with on a regular basis. Now we do. Now we have these relationships. So the next time there's some kind of need in the community, we already have those partnerships in place, and we already have been working with you, and you already have experience contracting with us, and that's a huge benefit that we didn't have before. I think I would definitely go into it with a little bit more assumption that the federal government doesn't have it all figured out. Like I expected that when they rolled that money out and they told us how to administer the program, that would be it, right? I did not expect that they would keep changing the rules constantly. So the next time, if this happened again, I would at least go into the experience expecting and anticipating that the rules would be constantly changing. And I wouldn't be so surprised and sort of frustrated by that. I would just go into that with the assumption, and we would be able to communicate that more clearly to our partner organizations that we're contracting with, that this is likely to change, but since we weren't expecting that, we didn't communicate that to our subcontractors. And so it was a surprise to all of us. And
it's like, that's not how we do business. So,
that's not how we usually do it. And
from?
so I think that would be definitely a lesson learned, is to just expect a little bit more chaos in terms of the federal and state administration of grant funds. I do think the state our state has been a great partner in this, and they did a pretty good job as best they could. I really think that a lot of the issues with these programs came from the federal level of not having things really well figured out. And, in their defense, interestingly, when the CARES Act, which provided that first tranche of funding that we put towards KEPA, when that was approved, it was, for some reason, it was allocated to the Department of Treasury to be the administering federal agency for it. They had no experience with rental assistance programs before. I don't know why they picked Treasury instead of HUD, which does all kinds of housing programs. But for some reason, they gave it to Treasury, and the Treasury Department had no experience with this kind of thing and had to figure it out as they went along. It's easy to sort of say, oh, the federal government screwed up, or the state government did, or the county government. But I always have to remind myself and everybody around me that the federal, state, and local government is made up of individuals like me who are trying to figure out how to do the best possible job we can as public servants. And so I know that there were some very, very hardworking people at the federal and state level that were doing their best to figure out how these funds needed to be spent in compliance with the laws that the legislators passed. And they didn't have a lot of experience with it. So we were all just doing the very best we could, and in very, very challenging circumstances. And I'm really, really proud of the work that we all did together. I'm so excited when we finally close out these grants and close out the KEPA program to look at the results. I mean, thousands of households received assistance to not get evicted. We distributed, it's going to be somewhere around $30 million by the time we're all done. Thousands of landlords got paid who hadn't gotten paid, because people couldn't afford to pay the rent. I mean, despite all of the problems and challenges and monitoring and changing rules, even despite all that, we still did an amazing job getting this money out to the people who really needed it.
And I want to encourage folks to seek out doing contracts and grants with the county. But before we get into that, is there a place that exists where grantors and grantees can talk to the feds and say, hey, this was our experience, please take this feedback and make some alterations based on that so it can be smoother throughout?
I haven't heard of a way to do that at the federal level. In fact, unfortunately, the Department of Treasury has notified us that they have kind of run out of funding to administer the federal eviction prevention program. So they're not even providing any more technical assistance or trainings for us. So they're basically shutting down their customer support operations for this program. So there isn't even a way to call somebody and get help anymore. I don't know if the federal government will have like a retrospective, hey, kind of what can we do better next time, like the state is trying to do. If there is, and I hear about it, I will definitely participate, and I will definitely provide that information to you and our network of providers. It's complicated, I think, too, because the higher level of government it is, the more they're trying to have rules that are applicable to a really broad range of communities and people and situations. And they're not really able to get down into the local level of why it didn't work in Kitsap County, right? Because they're looking at, we have to make policies and rules and requirements that meet all, every community in the whole country, their sort of situations. So if we wanted to make specific, if we did get a chance to comment to the federal government about what they could do better next time, we would want to be able to communicate it in a way that is like a very broad policy question of how they could do it better, not like it didn't work for me that Kitsap County required me to do XYZ thing, because they don't care about that. They want to understand at the policy level, what would they need to do differently for all communities in the entire country to make this program work better. So that's definitely something that we can all start thinking about. And if we have the opportunity to give that feedback, I think that would be really great.
That's got to be a really challenging way to go. So, let's say something happened like this in the future. Does the county say, well, at the end, the feds required all these things, so why don't we ask for these things up front? So even though they're not asking for it, we know later on they're going to do it. Or do you say, hey, we're not going to make more work for ourselves. We'll just deal with it as it comes. How do you make that kind of decision? Because it's I can see the benefit on both sides.
I mean, I think in this case with the pandemic, when the funding first rolled out, we were really excited because it felt like they were giving us pretty low requirements for things. And we were like, yay, let's just get that money out there. There was huge pressure from the federal government and the state government and local, everybody was like, spend that money, get it out there, get it to the people who need it. And we were like right on board with that. Absolutely. Like Katie said, let's get that money out in the community doing good as soon as possible and not wait until we have all the guidelines and rules in front of us to know to get the money out there. So even though I think the process was flawed and there was some challenges with it this time, I would every single time come down on the side of trying to get that money out there in the community. And then let's figure out how to do what the rules are, like once we know what those are. Like I just would not want to wait. I think if the federal government the next time around, if heaven forbid we have another pandemic or something or disaster that requires this kind of eviction prevention assistance, I think, Department of Treasury now has a better idea how to do it. And they will have a lot clearer understanding of how to roll out this type of program. They'd never done this type of program before. It was brand new to them too, brand new to them, brand new to commerce, brand new to us. And we all will have a much better idea of what we might be expected to do in the future. I think one of the biggest challenges for a lot of county governments people who do the housing and homelessness piece of it, like me, is that we didn't have a lot of experience with federal grant programs. So we often get pass-through money through the Department of Commerce that's federal, but we don't as often get direct federal allocations for this type of program. The county does get direct allocations for CDBG and home funding, and obviously the Housing Authority gets direct allocation for housing choice vouchers, but we hadn't had it for this type of eviction prevention program in the past. And so, yeah, it's a big learning curve for all of us.
So I have a question for both you and Katie. But first, can you share with how big the county office is, the staff for housing? Because this is a very small department.
Yeah. So, and it's grown a lot. So at the beginning of the pandemic, it was just me and our data specialist, Corey, who many of you know. He's our HMIS guru and support staff.
He has to get a horn for that.
He's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, Corey's awesome.
And then, during the pandemic, we hired Leah, who is our contracts coordinator. And our division right now has more than 60 different contracts that we have with different nonprofits in the community for all different kinds of grant programs. So it's a ton of work. So she does all the contract preparation and all the reimbursement request processing. So you can imagine 60 contracts, reimbursement requests from 60 contracts. It's a huge amount of work. And then we also have Virginia, who has come on to take over some of the contract management coordination for a couple of the grant programs. That core team, those three plus me, are sort of our core contract grant administrator team. In addition, we have two other staff. One is Jared Moran, who does our Homeless Encampment Outreach Program, the HEART program, which we've talked about on this show before. And we have a project manager who's specifically working on the Pacific Building, the Mile Hill Shelter Project. They're not really involved in the grant contracts and administration side. They have their own separate things that they're working on. So we have a little team of 6 of us who collectively are the Housing and Homelessness Division.
6 people pushing $30 million into Kitsap County.
Well, it's really 4 of us doing that, but yes. And we get great support from, there's other county staff who support the program, who administrative staff who process the invoices and get the bills paid. And we have great leadership from Doug Washburn, who's our department director, who's incredibly supportive of the programs that we are working on, and is our kind of leader for all of the departmental decisions that we get made about how to administer the grant funds in this program. So we're really lucky. And we have great commissioners who are very supportive of homeless programs and affordable housing programs, and have been amazing in providing as much flexibility as they can and being as supportive as they can with getting this money out to the people who really need it.
So let me phrase this question for the both of you. How does an organization apply for grants with the county or BHA? Any kind of tips or words of insight or wisdom?
I'll
as
start
a
with Bremerton Housing
your
Authority doesn't provide grants.
Ooh,
We
okay.
don't have grants.
Do you do any contracting
We do lots of contracting.
with
Um,
organizations?
So yeah, we are a contractor. So we don't do a lot of contracting with. We do have a few subcontracts, especially our building our buildings and maintaining our buildings and things like that. But definitely a different perspective. I think in this conversation, at least our housing authority side is more of the grantee. We monitor our landlords through inspection processes to make sure they're complying with the rules of the program and whatnot. We verify income and do things like that. But I think from this conversation, we work with the community in a very different way. So.
Kristen?
And Marwan, our divisions, the Housing and Homelessness Division's work is, for the most part, we are grant administrators. We get federal and state and local grant funding that's dedicated for homelessness and affordable housing. And then we have various different ways that money gets distributed depending on the grant source. So typically, the funding is distributed in a competitive way where we'll issue either a notice of funding availability, which is called a NOFA. And that basically says, hey, there's some grant funding available. Apply for, you propose to us how you want to spend the money to meet these goals, or to serve this population, or to provide this type of service. Or a request for proposals, which is an RFP. And those are typically, the county wants to buy this type of service. You submit a proposal for how you're going to deliver that service. So one example of this is we have some local grant funds, a homeless housing grant program and affordable housing grant program funds. Some of those are available specifically to fund homeless shelters. That's all we use them for. And we issue an RFP every 2 years to homeless shelters saying, tell us how you want to use the grant funds that are set aside for shelters. Another chunk of that money is offered up in a NOFA, where we say, there's a bunch of different things you might want to be able to do with this funding. As long as you're helping people move out of homelessness, you propose to us what you would like to do with that money. So typically we do that with those grant funds every other year, and they're 2-year grants, or they're 1-year grant with a renewal. Sometimes we have some state funds that we will get, and those are typically issued through an RFP, because the state will say, here's what we want you to do with this money, county. And then the county says, okay, we're going to make an RFP, and then we will ask organizations to submit proposals for how they're going to do that specific activity. So that's generally the way that those grant funds come down. We did it a little differently during the pandemic. There were some there were some sort of looser requirements for procurement because we were, operating during a pandemic and we needed to contract really quickly. But generally, that's how the grant funds are awarded, is through a competitive process. And you can go on to the Housing and Homelessness Division webpage, and we always announce opportunities for funding. And the next one for the homeless housing and affordable housing grant programs will be next summer, is when the funding will, that RFP will, and that NOFA will come out next summer.
So, Kirsten, is this the page here?
Yeah, yes. And for the housing, homelessness, affordable housing, it's the coordinated grant application page is where we have information about that grant opportunity. The county also has other grant opportunities. We have an awesome CDBG, which stands for Community Development Block Grant Program, and a HOME program. Those are two federal funding programs that are specifically for affordable housing and sort of associated programs. Some of that money can be spent on community services, like food banks and literacy programs and childcare and all that kind of a thing. So some of that funding goes for that. But the big chunk of it, the majority of it, goes for either rehabbing and fixing up affordable housing projects or creating new affordable housing using that funding.
So it sounds like here it says receive text or email updates. So if a new opportunity comes available, you can get alerted.
Correct.
So I would definitely recommend that if you are considering doing business with the county, that you receive these updates so you don't have to constantly check and see what's going on, because we're super busy and it's like, oh, I forgot to check. So then they'll remind you. And I'm on quite a few of these, and it's super easy to do. You just put your email in there. Mine's already in there, and submit. Bam, that's it. And then you get to pick. And I will warn you, I accidentally went in here accidentally on purpose, and I clicked it a lot because I was super interested. And now I need to go back and uncheck. It's like alert, alert, alert. Tidewater, this,
Yeah,
that. Like, oh
you
my
get
goodness.
a lot. And then we also typically announce opportunities at our Housing and Homelessness Coalition meetings. We want people to know that the funding is available. We want people to apply for it. We don't want it to be a secret. So you can also find out at those meetings when grant funding is available.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a great topic. I definitely appreciate you wanting to come on and talk about monitoring. Uh, again, clarity is real important, and folks experience things in different ways. And when you don't understand why something is happening, it feels like something is happening to you, and that may not be the case, even if that's how it feels. Um, and from my perspective, again, working with grants and contracts through the county, definitely, different experiences. But we've always, been able to submit what we need to submit and kind of work through it. And, it's been a really great experience being able to help all of the clients that we were able to support in staying housed. And for whatever the difficulty was, it's definitely worth it. We go through it again tomorrow if that's what it took to keep someone housed. So just want to put that out there. Definitely grace, patience, communication is key. One of the great things that I like that the county did, and I think this was maybe the county and jointly with KCR, was setting up meetings every Friday with PowerPoints. And I think that was one of the responses to things changing. And it was like, well, let's do that so we can keep the dialogue open and folks can ask questions in a Zoom. So I thought that was really effective in trying to, navigate the flying the plane while it was being built. So shout out to the county. Again, 4 to 6 people doing all this work is huge. It's huge.
Thank you, Marwan. It takes all of us to do it. And as I said, my biggest gratitude over the last couple of years has definitely been forming new partnerships and finding more people to be part of this effort, or people that we didn't know about who were part of the effort and we just didn't know about them. And now we're more closely partners, and we have a better idea of what each other does and how we can support each other to do the work. So that's just been a huge blessing, in a silver lining in all of this challenge. And we've learned how to do some things better. we've learned where we need to work on doing different things better in the future. And it's definitely been a steep learning curve for all of us, but we've learned.
And there's a lot of organizations that are working together that didn't work together before. There's a lot more synergy in the organizations that were already working together, so that's been fantastic. Katie, you are the one on this panel that always provides the sage question or words toward the end. Uh, what is your sage word that
Well,
you
I know we're running out of time. Maybe there's going to be a chapter 2 of this, because from the housing authority side, as a public housing agency, we have lots of programs, working with the housing choice voucher and doing monitoring with our landlords, and getting monitored ourselves through all the rental assistance programs we're part of. But about 40 employees on the other side of our agency actually perform monitoring for multifamily properties for HUD. As a federal agency, we make sure multifamily properties who provide affordable housing under certain financial requirements they have are actually doing everything they're supposed to do. So that's a large part of our organization. And we don't bring it up a lot here because it's more of, we provide monitoring for Washington, Nebraska, and Utah on behalf of HUD. So it's quite a different world. It's hard to fit in with what we're talking about right now, especially we want to really hone in on the community piece, because this is really important and it provides so many families quality, affordable housing, but it's a completely different program. But I have to say, about half of our employees are part of this very large contract. So like I said, we're kind of the grantees in this situation, but it is an interesting program, and I'd love to talk about it more in the future.
And
I
I
think
want to
that should be a special
amplify.
show.
Sorry, I just want to amplify one thing that Katie said that I totally failed to touch on. And it's a super, super important part of monitoring. And that is that some of the monitoring requirements and some of the things that we require, our subcontractors to do is to protect the people that are being served. So Katie was talking about monitoring multifamily units to make sure that they meet all the habitability standards, that they're safe places for people to live, that landlords are taking care of them. That is a really big part of monitoring too. It's not just about following these rules and these policies for the sake of following the rules and policies. Most of them are in place so that people are protected who are accessing these funds. Another example of that is grievance policies. So the state and federal government requires that every sub-recipient, every subcontractor has a grievance policy where if it's somebody who's a client of a program doesn't feel like they were treated right, they have a way to complain and they have a way to get some recourse on that. So that's one thing that we're monitoring for, to make sure our subcontractors have a way that people can complain. We have rules around, not allowing organizations to require religious practices in order for people to receive services. Like, that's another way that we're trying to make sure that people are protected. We have rules around people who are fleeing domestic violence being notified of their rights and making sure that their privacy is kept safe, and so that they're safe. So behind every single one of these requirements is something that is generally trying to protect people who are very vulnerable and wanting to make sure that they have good access to the services and these resources. So that's another really important point that I really want to drive home for people, that it feels like a lot of extra work, but there's a reason for it. And it's generally to try to help people and make sure that, we have equal access laws. Like, you have to have a policy saying that you're not discriminating against people, right? Another way we're trying to make sure your organization is protecting the rights of everybody to have access to these resources. So the list goes on and on and on, and it becomes this really long list. But like, behind almost every one of them is some good reason why that requirement is in place.
Well, and let me add, from my perspective, being one of the buy-in fours, right? It can kind of feel that way. And the ones that you're talking about, I remember specifically when those updates came and it was like, okay, you need to do this, you need to do that. And at the end of the day, for me, it was like, all right, being the leader of G2 is like, here's what the requirements are. And if we don't have these things, this is helping us to be in compliance with the feds. So if we're going to do business with the feds, maybe directly and not the county, then we already have these things in place. So really, it's an
Exactly.
opportunity. So take advantage of it. So that's how I looked at it. And then it's one less thing that we'll have to do later, right? I'd rather have over prepared than under prepared and scrambling to get things done. So that was the perspective that I looked at it in. I think that
And
might
I
be
think that's
helpful
a
for
really
everybody.
healthy way to look at it. As I said, there's generally good reasons for these things, like having good financial policies, having good organizational operation policies. Like all of these things are sort of rules because they're generally accepted to be a good way to do things. Sometimes adding it all up together, it can feel like a lot. And so taking the opportunity to get your organization up to speed on these different things is only going to benefit you in the future if you want to do
Yeah,
more government contracting. Yeah.
absolutely. And the benefit in that too is, we're still a small org, we'll be 5 in February, but with that, doing business with the county is new for us. We've only been doing that for a couple of years. And so we're learning, we're getting better, we're having things in place. We can take on bigger opportunities. And so we're just putting ourselves in position. And we didn't have to do it all at once, right? It wasn't a thing of, you know what, you need to have this huge Bible of stuff done and set before you can start doing business with the county. Maybe under crisis in that regard, hey, let's come on and get it going. Okay, build these things up, and now you're good, and now you can compete business as some of the bigger organizations. So again, for us,
Yeah.
I look at it as an opportunity and allowing us to be able to grow and scale up. So definitely appreciate it.
And I've founded a few nonprofits myself, a bunch of nonprofits too, and I've seen every organization goes through the phase where they have to start getting all of their policies and procedures in place and getting kind of these best practices put into place, because there's a reason why those are there, because they're a good way to do things. I think during the pandemic and sort of this sudden contracting with the county government, some organizations had to speed up that process, right? It would have happened
Right.
organically over maybe a longer period of time. And because of these contracting requirements, they had to do it really quickly, and it felt more intense and kind of like more work. But as you say, at the end of the day, they're probably in a better position now, in terms of having that organizational structure in place than they were before.
Yeah, and I'll say, it doesn't mean that it was easy because you're trying to execute, the contract and help your clients. And it's like, oh, we got to do this now too. Yeah, it wasn't easy. It's hard on some of those things and trying to craft a language and make sure that everything is right. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's a net positive and not a net negative. So, there's different outlooks you can have as you go forward in life. And I tend to be on the more positive side. All right. Man, this was a great conversation. Katie, you already picked up a part two for monitoring.
Right.
Uh, Kirsten, what's new, coming up with the county? I wasn't able to make it to the open house. I know Rob and Stephanie came to the open house, but you
Yeah.
wanted to kind of share that with us? How did that turn out?
Yeah, we had a great open house at the Pacific Building, which is going to be the new shelter. We're deeply in the final pieces of the interior design for that building, particularly the pet area and the kitchen. And I was just on a call earlier today, and we were talking about where all the electrical outlets going to go, where all the charging stations. And I mean, just like that level of detail is kind of where we are, which is really good because it means we're getting closer to submitting that final permit that we need to submit. We got lots of great feedback at the open house, which was really a lot of. I was just so grateful that a lot of people showed up and they said, we just wanted to be here to show our support for this project, and that meant a lot. That we had about 150 people show up, and a lot of them were there because they think this is a really important project that we're working on. We're getting monitored right now by the state auditor, and we're also doing monitoring. I'm doing on-site monitoring at 2 organizations this week. Virginia's deeply in a long list of monitoring that she's been working her way through. We're gearing up for the point in time count next January. And I'm also on the Project Connect planning group, which is working on putting together those big services fairs in January around the point in time count. So that's a big chunk of work. The severe weather shelters is really ramped up this time of year. They're actually activated tonight and are likely to be activated through the rest of the week because of the freezing temperatures overnight. So the severe weather shelters are always looking for volunteers. And we really want to spread the word to any of our neighbors and community members who are sleeping outside to please make your way to a severe weather shelter. There's one in Kingston, there's one in Paulsbo, there's one in Port Orchard, there's one in Silverdale, and then you can go to the Salvation Army. And we partner with Gather Together, Grow Together. This is an awesome thing that we added last year where you can essentially dial for a ride to a severe weather shelter. So if you are somewhere that's far away from one of these severe weather shelters and you need to get there, you can call Gather Together to Grow Together, and they will help you figure out, help get you a ride to one of these shelters. And then in the morning, they will take you back to where you came from, essentially. So that's been a great way to help people when there isn't transportation late at night, be able to get to the shelters. People who want to go to the shelter, the severe weather shelters, have to check in between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. So make sure you share the word about that. And they can just show up at the door of any of these locations, and they will get a safe, warm, dry place to stay overnight. And then in the morning, the shelters close. So that's a ton of work. We have amazing partner organizations throughout the county that operate those, and the county just sort of provides advertising, collective effort around that. So we want to get the word out and have people taking advantage of those shelters. And if you are a person who wants to volunteer, they always need volunteers to help staff them because it is 100% volunteer staffed program. So yeah, that's a bit of what we're working on.
I have a question. So you say they close it in the morning. So where does everybody go after?
Yeah, it's really unfortunate that the buildings that these shelters are operating in typically have programming during the daytime, and so they aren't able to allow people to stay there during the daytime. So typically people will leave in the morning and go, either back to their site, their encampment for the day, or a food program, or a coffee shop, or a day center, or wherever. There's just different places that people will go during the day. It's not optimal, right? I mean, in a perfect world, we would have 24/7 shelters where everybody could stay who needed it. And we don't have that. And so the severe weather shelter program is a stopgap, Band-Aid, life-saving program that is doing the best we can with limited resources, but it definitely has its limitations and its scope. And we're really grateful that we have so many community volunteers and nonprofit organizations and churches that are willing to operate the severe weather shelters and make it possible that nobody has to sleep outside.
And please pass out that information. Folks can subscribe to the shelter to get active notifications. They can text Kitsap SWS to 898-211. Standard message and data rates apply. Usually we get word around 1 p.m., 2 p.m. that the shelter is going to be open. But as Kirsten was saying, looks like it's going to be open for the rest of the week. Please let someone know. The phone number is 360-373-3000. I think we were out by Suquamish picking up someone and getting them to the shelter last night. So
excellent.
It is cold outside.
And seasonably cold. It's not usually so cold this early in the year.
Early, yes. Please let them know. Make the call. Let's get them there. And then in the morning, we can pick them up and get them, as Kirsten said, to a place that's providing food back to their encampment where they need to go. So just do not want people unhoused in this severe weather. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, thanks, Marwan. And we are so grateful to partner with G2G2 on this. It has been a huge additional way to support people getting into those severe weather shelters, having the ability to call G2G2 for a ride. So that has been an awesome partnership.
Well, one of the things that, because I talked about this yesterday during the, hey, get ready to vote, everyone. There's not one in Bremerton. So it's Port Orchard, Silverdale, Kingston, and Paulsbo. So if folks are in the Bremerton area, they've got to get all the way out to one of these locations. So that's a hardship, and we're here to fill that gap. So
Yeah, so
please, please.
I would say two things to
Mhm.
that. One, the Salvation Army has historically, during freezing temperatures, pretty much just let anybody in who shows up at their doors, and that's why we don't have one in Bremerton
Mhm.
specifically. They started out as a severe weather shelter, and then they went to a winter shelter, and then they went to an all the time shelter, and that is going to be ending here in next spring. But don't hesitate to go to the Salvation Army. They'll often take people in, even if they've been banned in the past. They don't want to have anybody sleeping outside either. The other thing I would say is that if there's a church group or organization that's interested in starting a severe weather shelter in Bremerton,
Ooh,
please reach out and talk to me. I can. Virginia is actually our new severe weather shelter kind of lead person. Corey has done it for years and is very knowledgeable. We could provide you with lots of information about how it works and what the county's role is and what your role is and all of that. But we are happy to support it. But the severe weather shelters are really run by individual church and community groups. The county's role is pretty limited. We qualify volunteers, we do background checks, we advertise, we help, make sure that all the policies are consistent and everybody's, doing things in a way that is fair and equitable and all of that. But they're 100% volunteer run. There's no budget for it. It's an amazing, amazing community effort. And to my knowledge, we have the most robust and active severe weather shelter program in the state right now.
really?
Yeah.
Horn for that.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah.
That doesn't go understated, right?
Yeah.
That's big. And the last thing we'll say is, to volunteer, it's not a lot, right? It's just a few hours.
Yeah. The
Not a
shifts are
lot.
typically, there's usually like 3 shifts a night. And anyway, we can get into the details.
Mhm.
One of the shifts that's often really hard to fill is overnight. So like the middle of the night shift, if you're at a real night owl or you or have the time to volunteer overnight, that it's a huge need for people to come in and fill that. Usually like overnight shift.
Yep, I'm gonna put that in the chat there for anyone that wants to open up that PDF so they can see that. All right, so
And you
now
can
we will
go to
definitely.
the county. Sorry, the county has a severe weather shelter website that you can go to, and on that website, it says when the shelters are open. It provides the flyer that Marwan showed you. It provides where you can kind of to get those text alerts, and it has a place where you can link to register to be a volunteer.
All
And I
right, so
can put
please
that
check
in
that
the
out.
chat.
And Katie, I'm gonna let us have you lead us out.
I thank you, Marwan, for putting this together. I mean, always we just come here prepared to talk about everything we're up to, and I'm just excited to see what the next one is. We have to decide what our next deep dive is.
I know it's always a good one, so I always look forward to it for sure. All right. Well, we went a little over, but this was chock full of goodness. I definitely want to thank Kirsten for always making herself busy and busy. She's always busy, available on the second Wednesday of the month. As you see, it's a staff of 4 to 6 people doing all this work. So we definitely are honored that you carve out time to be here with us for 90 minutes and answer questions and educate us on all things housing and homelessness. And of course, Katie, you are the bastion of consistency. So we definitely appreciate you. And we hope to have Jill and Matt back next week. I'm Arwan Cameron for everyone. This is The Conduit. We will be back tonight with the study session for City Council. All right, everyone.